welcome to the Therapist Thrival Guide. My name is Miranda. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm here with Jennifer Keene. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. So I'm Jennifer Keene, licensed professional clinical counselor. I've been clinical operations director here at Ellie Mental Health for about 3 years now, running 2 clinics in Minnesota. And then I also work as the clinical lead of our Protector Overwatch program. We provide wellness services to first responders, military service-connected individuals, veterans, and their family members.
Today we are talking about letter writing, but this is reminding me that we've talked about doing like a first responders episode. So maybe we still need to do that at some point to come.
Got to pencil it in.
Yeah. Exactly. But this is a topic that you brought to me because you have had other clinicians ask you questions and wanting to give them advice, wanting to kind of talk through some of the implications or questions.
It might be helpful just to talk about the different kinds of letters that clients tend to request or seek support with.
So when we talk about letter writing, what types of letters are we talking about when it comes to like therapy?
Mm-hmm. It could be letters for an emotional support animal or housing accommodations so they can have that emotional support animal kind of at their apartment building. Could be academic accommodations for school, gender-affirming care, bariatric surgery, workplace accommodations, FMLA. I mean, the list probably goes on, and I'm sure I'm missing some.
Yeah. And I haven't had too many requests for letters, and so I am excited to kind of hear some of your thoughts and talk through some of this because can be kind of a touchy subject for some clinicians. And I think that the guidance is a little bit unclear sometimes. And even like people are wishy-washy sometimes about like sharing this is what we normally say, or like it feels like there can be some legal implications with some of this. I know that like, for example, a lot of clinicians will say, like, make sure you add that you can't attest to the temperament of the animal when you are writing an ESA letter or something, just in case that letter bites someone or, like things like that. And so I get a little bit intimidated or like nervous about writing letters because it feels like you are putting your stamp of approval on something or that you are attesting to something. And I don't know, like I know that there's also people who can go get letters online for things. And so sometimes it just feels like a subject where you're like, I want to be able to support my client the best way possible. But it's also, I don't want to do anything that would put my license at risk either. Sure. And so I think that's why it makes me a little bit like, oh man, this is a great topic because it's important, because I'm like, if it's a topic that makes me nervous or like,
sure, it's a sign that there's more I need to learn about it.
Yeah, exactly. So when we talk about letter writing, like what are some of the questions that clinicians usually ask you or come to you about?
I think in general, they're wanting to know how to write the letter, what to put in it. Are there templates that are available? Things that just make it easier because, as you mentioned, you haven't done very many of them, right? And I'm sure in my 10, 15 plus years, I also probably haven't written very many of them. So templates would be nice since we don't do them very often.
Right. Well, so, okay, let's talk about times where, like you talked about different types of letters that a clinician might write. Can you share a couple of different, like, loosely vague cases where you've written letters for that you felt like were really, like, clinically needed?
Sure. I think one example is the emotional support animal. I've written that for a few clients that needed the letter either because it waived certain fees at wherever they resided, or allowed them to bring that animal to other public places or maybe even on an airplane. So they needed those letters. And I think it was assessing, what does this animal do for you? How does it support you, right? What's the difference between just a pet versus an emotional support animal versus a service dog or a service animal? So really just kind of assessing those dynamics.
Yeah. So what do you look for if a client were to come to you and say, hey, can you write a letter for my dog to be an emotional support animal? Like, I mean, you just said one of the questions that you would ask, but what would show you that like this is truly an emotional support animal and not just like a person that wants to get their dog into an apartment for free?
I think we have to look at their symptoms, their diagnosis, and how does having that pet help support them cope with the symptoms that they're experiencing. I think that's the main area. But also you're looking at, am I writing this for just one animal? Are you asking me to write it for multiple animals? Because that can be a little suspicious.
Yeah.
Again, but typically it's one animal. And then is this an animal you've had already? And how does it already support you? Or is this a new animal? And also looking at sometimes taking care of animals, especially if it's a new pet, right? That's not potty trained and things like that. Is that actually something that's going to cause more anxiety and distress versus is this something that truly is, it's going to help you get outside and walk more? It's that social companion, really. So really just looking at really the overall benefit analysis.
Yeah, because I think that one of the things that I see on like Facebook message boards or something sometimes is like people will say, oh, I had a client come for a diagnostic assessment, and in like their very first appointment, they were like, I need you to write me an ESA. And a lot of therapists kind of frown on just like writing an ESA in your very first appointment. Can you tell me like why that would be?
I think the concern, and unfortunately this has happened to me as well, right, is after I write that letter, I never see that client again. So is it a one and done thing? Or do I say like, sure, I'm willing to explore writing this with you, but maybe my policy is you have to attend so many sessions first before I'll be willing to write it.
Why do you why do you think it would be helpful to see them for a couple of sessions in order to write that letter?
I think in some aspects, just getting a thorough idea of what we're dealing with, right? There's so much that could be covered in a 60-minute session that are we really getting to everything? And the diagnostic assessment is time consuming as it is, right? So yeah, we might need additional sessions to really then dive in to the nitty-gritty of kind of what that animal would do and how it would support you.
Well, and I think my fear as a clinician is like, I'm not afraid of like being ghosted by a client, but I'm more afraid of like, okay, you're using me for this letter, and that was really like you weren't actually here to benefit, like to better yourself. You weren't really here for therapy. You were really just here to like get this letter and then leave. And I know that there's like online, like you could purchase a letter like that online, and people really like frown on whether or not those are legit. Like there's just, I feel like there's some worry kind of like concerning some of those things. So it makes sense that like as a clinician, if I'm going to put my name on something, I want to be able to speak to how like you're coping and like what this animal actually does or how it helps you. But no, that makes sense. Other types of letters that you've written?
FMLA documentation. I guess maybe not so much a letter, but like documentation to support someone taking a medical leave from work. I don't do it a lot because I think in those situations, if as an outpatient therapist who sees someone typically maybe just once a week, if you are needing time off from work, time away from school, that's probably a sign that your mental health is exacerbated to the point where maybe once a week therapy is not enough.
Sure.
So a lot of times in those situations, I do refer to a higher level of care and let them know that typically the social workers are well-versed in filling out that paperwork. They can do it for you. But there are occasional occurrences where maybe it's more intermittent FMLA that, hey, for flare-ups of this condition, I might need some time away from work, or even for their children. I've had that where a parent needed time away from work in case her child had flare-ups, so that they could pick them up from school and take care of them and things like that.
Yeah, the only time I've written an FMLA paper or letter was when I was the therapist for a teenager, and I wrote the document for mom because mom was having to like leave all the time, and kid actually did go to a more intensive, higher level of care eventually. But at that time, mom was having to leave for psychiatry appointments and for our therapy appointments, and kid ended up doing like groups as well. And so that's the only time I've ever had a parent ask me for an FMLA letter. But that in that one, it made so much sense to me where it was like, yeah, you're doing everything you can to take care of
Mhm.
your kid and your job is not supportive of this. And
Yeah.
so that was a tricky one. But what about, I think that like there are, I'm just thinking of like FMLA. I always think of like after you give birth or something, but what other types
Mm.
of like times where like for your clients, were they just like experiencing a lot of anxiety and needing to like
Sure.
not go to work some days, or what did it look like for them?
A lot of time, yes, it was significant episodes of anxiety or depression where going to work maybe put their employment at risk because they weren't able to focus, they weren't able to be productive, they were having crying spells. So if they tried to go to work and needed to leave early all the time, right, they were maybe at risk of being let go or being
Oh,
written
yeah.
up or things like that. So really it was better to say, let's take some time off from work,
Mm-hmm.
medically, legally protect your employment
Mm-hmm.
while you get care for
Mm-hmm.
yourself.
What about for a client who like needed to do a higher level of care? Would you write that letter, or you would want the social worker or someone at the higher level of care to write that?
Typically, I would refer it
Okay.
out to the
Yeah,
provider at the higher level of care.
that makes sense. Okay. What about, you talked about like gender affirming surgeries. Talk to me a
Mhm.
little bit about like when are letters needed for that? I guess I don't know if you know the answer
Yeah,
to that.
that is a good question. I would say my experience is probably anytime someone's doing like gender affirming surgery,
Mm.
or
So not just like
maybe even
care,
hormone
just oh,
replacement
okay.
therapy, maybe
Sure.
in those situations. I'm not 100% sure on that
Yeah.
one. But I think typically it's more surgery,
Mm-hmm.
because even like bariatric surgery, things like that. In those situations, they're wanting letters just to make sure that the client understands
Mm-hmm.
the risks associated with the surgery and that they have general coping mechanisms to cope with kind of whatever might come their way afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, so is it really just to those types of letters? Do you think that it's mainly the doctor just kind of trying to like be like, okay, you've actually thought about this sort of, and
Mhm.
like you've talked about it with a therapist, or like what are the things that you're putting in a letter like that?
Yeah, I've never actually written those letters, but I
Okay.
know that there are templates out there and specifically for gender affirming care. A lot of people reference WPATH for standards of care. And so that's a specific um, kind of like guideline or template on how
Oh,
to write those letters.
is that like an organization?
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So they have templates and they have information on on like what to include in some of those things.
Mhm.
Because I have heard about, a lot of therapists, even at Ellie, have written top surgery letters or like different letters around this. I haven't, but it is kind of interesting to me, that you need a letter for some of these different surgeries and things, but then also I don't know if I would feel equipped to write a letter like that. I know
Mm.
that one of the things that you and I talked about before we started recording was kind of like referring out to experts when you don't really know the answer to some of these things, or when you don't feel like it's within your scope of practice. And so like I guess I'm just thinking through, would this be a scenario where you'd be like, I think that you should probably be seeing someone more well versed in LGBTQ issues
Mhm.
or something like that if they were asking you to write a letter?
Yeah, I'll share that used to be my mentality a couple of years ago.
Okay.
Um, but then I had another clinician kind of push back on that and say why, right? Like, what if that person has a long wait list and they can't get
That's
into
true.
that gender affirming
Mhm.
care specialist? And I think that's also why WPATH kind of put out this kind of template or this
Mhm.
guidance on how to write these letters
Mhm.
so that kind of all mental health clinicians can write these
Okay,
letters.
that's a really good point because it is hard to find a therapist. It's also, I think of like if I were to just refer a client out every time I felt like something wasn't within my scope of practice, then I wouldn't really grow as a clinician, first off. But
Hmm.
then also, it would be kind of a disservice to some clients, especially if they've built a lot of trust with you
Mm.
and you've done a lot of work together, just to be like, okay, you can start over with someone else to get this. But what do you know? Like, I think that my worry slash like, I would be concerned that a letter like that is asking me to be like, they have thought about this decision and I can promise you that that they are 100% on board with this and that they're never going to regret this.
Sure.
And I think that that's like, I don't know, like a little bit of a concern of mine. But
I think that's why a lot of clinicians even have concerns writing letters for maybe military service members, right? That are they deployable, right? Are they able to go over to a war
that's
zone?
a letter?
Yes, sometimes. Yeah,
Oh.
that they want you to sign off on that, and it's like, yeah, I don't know how they're going to act in that specific stressor.
Yes.
But some of the feedback I've gotten is really how would they handle any stressor, right? What have been their coping mechanisms for if they got a new job or if they had a new baby in their household, right? How do they cope with everyday stressors?
Yeah.
And to speak to that, right? Because, we're not fortune tellers. We don't have crystal balls. We don't know 100% how someone's going to react. But in general, can we speak to their kind of innate coping mechanisms?
Okay, I appreciate that because I think that with a lot of these topics, I think that that's where some of my fear is. Like, what if I write an ESA letter and the dog bites someone? Or what if I write this letter and then they regret it, or somebody calls me out on it, or says like, what sort of level of, training do you have in this sort of thing? And so I think that it makes sense that you are kind of speaking more towards like their coping in general, but how much information should you even be putting in some of these letters?
That's a really good question. I would say as little as possible, right?
Yeah.
What is the information that's truly needed for this letter, right? Diagnosis, date that they've started seeing you,
Yeah.
And I think it just also depends on what the letter is.
Sure.
But yeah, minimal information is necessary.
Well, and like, I'm even thinking of times where I've had clients ask me to write letters. And there have been times where I've said like, yeah, I will absolutely write this letter. I'm in full support of this. And there have been other times where I'm like, oh, hit the brakes a little bit. Like, I'm not sure if I feel comfortable writing a letter like this. And in those circumstances, it's always been either like, I had a client who asked for a housing accommodation letter because she wanted to live by herself on her college campus. And she was someone who had been diagnosed with depression. And I was like, what we know about like how you cope when you are struggling with your depression is that you need to be around people. And actually, like when you are isolating yourself, it actually makes some of your symptoms worse. And obviously I didn't like point blank say like, hey, this is what I think about it. But I like after asking more questions about what she feels like is helpful to her and like how this accommodation is going to help and support her symptoms, we were able to kind of decide together, like, I don't know if this is actually the best decision for you. But then I've had other times where I had a client who asked me to write a letter, and this was unlike any letter I've ever seen, where this client wasn't in communication with their parents anymore. And they were asking me to write a letter kind of like essentially saying that they were abused by their parents. And so they're not like in communication with their parents. And so that is why they are not getting like financial support from them or something like along those lines. And I like, there were lots of red flags to me where I was like, okay, everything that I know about your relationship with your parents has been reported by you. So I don't feel like I can say things like very concretely, like you were abused by your parents, or like your parents did this, or like pretty much any type of letter that speaks to someone else's behavior, or any type of content in a letter that speaks to someone else's behavior, I didn't feel really comfortable writing in this circumstance. And
sure,
so
it's not like you witnessed it.
No. And so that was one of those ones where I was like, I don't know how to get this, how to support you with this. Because like, yes, I want to support you, but also like I don't feel like I can like speak to what happened, because all of what I know is actually just comes from you. And so what we ended up being able to do was I wrote just a very general letter saying this is the client's name and this is their diagnosis. And the diagnosis was PTSD. And so then I think they were able to kind of use their own supporting documentation to get what they needed in terms of like accommodations, so that I wasn't the one that was like speaking to their parents' behavior.
Sure.
But oh man, that was a hard one where like some of these just feel like ethical dilemmas or something.
Sure, you
find
want to be factual and to
Right.
avoid maybe opinions.
Yes. No, and I think that that's where that one was a little bit trickier too. Okay, other types of letters that you've gotten and like other guidance that you've given clinicians.
Sure, maybe like court summaries. So someone needed a letter for probation. And really the letter just needed to be that they completed sessions.
Yeah.
So again, that was able to be a little bit more generic, but sometimes we have clients that want us to speak to maybe like a parenting plan or custody plans. And so those we probably are a little bit more firm and say, nope, that's outside of our scope of practice to speak to those issues. But again, I can provide more of a generic letter.
No, that makes sense. I think that if those can like start to lean more into opinions anyways, when people are asking, when you're like in the middle of a custody battle and you're asking your therapist to write a letter based on your work together is one thing, but asking them to then like give opinions to the court feels like a whole nother thing. Because again, the therapist only knows what you're telling them. They don't know if your ex-husband was actually super narcissistic. They only know the stories that are coming from you. And so it's hard to actually make some of those calls and really speak to any of that in letters. But
I would say in general, if it's something that you might put in the treatment plan, that might be something I'd write a letter about, right? So if I therapeutically think you need an emotional support animal, I'm probably going to be on board with writing a letter for that.
Oh,
right?
sure, yeah.
If you need a higher level of care and time off from work, I'm probably going to be willing to write letters for that, right? And so I think sometimes that's a rule that clinicians might follow is, okay, am I going to write this into the treatment plan?
That is such a good idea because it's even like with an emotional support animal, I think I can see how when you're writing a treatment plan, you might include that they're utilizing them or that they're seeing their, anxiety decrease and the intervention being taking your ESA for a walk or doing different things like that. So that makes sense to me.
I've had other people see it as more like a prescription. I'm going to prescribe this emotional support animal. So then they might refer to the medication prescriber or psychiatrist to write those letters instead if it feels like it's a prescription.
What about like, you mentioned school accommodations. What types of letters would you give for school accommodations?
Again, we try to keep it a little bit more generalized, but we write in there the diagnosis and kind of what kind of accommodations might be supportive for that individual, just to support maybe a parent's pursuit of an IEP or a 504 plan, right? So maybe this client might benefit from additional testing time or the ability to use a quiet space when they're completing testing.
No, that makes sense. What about, I want to go back to the one that you mentioned, like the military letter. Like, when would you ask for that? If the person was about to be deployed or if they were deciding if they were deployable? Like, what?
Yeah, I believe it happens when maybe they get their deployment orders.
Okay.
And they're going kind of through different checks and balances, right? Because before you deploy, you have to go to the dentist and you got to do all these different steps, right? And so if they know the person is already in therapy, or maybe even if they're not in therapy, they might say, we need you to meet with a mental health professional and just kind of get the all clear that you're capable and ready.
Interesting. No, that makes sense. Are there other types of letters that you might need? I mean, I know that you work so closely with like Protector Overwatch, but have you ever had to write letters for that population?
Yeah, sometimes it's more about like return to work letters, like if someone took some time off to address PTSD, or letters linking the PTSD to their service. So sometimes we've done those as well.
So when you're writing a letter like this, could it, again, like it's not like you're writing a letter saying they're ready for work, or like they are completely cured of PTSD. Maybe is it more of that you're writing it of like, this was their diagnosis, this is how many sessions they went to, these were their goals, sort of thing? Or are you able to put more of like opinions and things like that into it?
I would say that we try to be as factual as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, sometimes we have to go through their job description with them and say, okay, are you capable of doing this task
Sure.
or this task? You know? And so once especially I'm thinking if they're going back to work after some time off, right? So if they feel like they're able to do all their tasks without accommodations, then we're able to say, okay, they're ready to return to work.
Okay. And then, there was a different type of surgery that you talked about, but I don't remember what it was called. Bariatric. And that's like weight loss surgery? Okay. So tell me more about like, what sort of letters would you need for that? Or what sort of letter writing advice would you have for that?
I don't know that I've given specific advice on that one. But in general, I would say, has this client thoroughly assessed the risks associated with this surgery? And do they feel prepared to be able to cope with it afterwards?
That's it reminds me of like hysterectomies or something, because I don't know if this is still a thing, but I remember a friend of mine going through the steps towards a hysterectomy and needing to get like a psych eval and needing to, maybe it wasn't a psych eval, maybe it was just a letter from a therapist. But at the time, that was so interesting to me because it felt like
maybe especially if the hysterectomy was early, like younger in age.
Yeah, she was
right?
younger. Yeah,
because that is a big decision.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think in that scenario, she needed a letter from a psychologist or a therapist or someone to kind of speak to that they've thought about this, that they've talked about this in session, and I think it'd be similar to the one you were just talking about, where they've weighed the risks and they've, talked through how they would cope with this or how they would move forward with it.
I think so too. And I'm also not sure if it's the doctor themselves who request that the clients get the letter, or if maybe the insurance companies are wanting this stuff. I don't know.
Interesting. No, just to like make sure that you're absolutely certain in some of these things. This is a whole nother case, but it's like men don't need vasectomy letters, but whatever. Of course, those are reversible. But no, interesting. Okay. The other types of letters I was thinking about recently that I did a consult for was adoption letters. And I remember when I was going through the adoption process, if I was seeing a therapist at the time, or if I had seen a therapist previously, I needed to get a letter from the therapist saying that I was like fit to be a parent and that I was fit to move forward with it, and essentially had to like say what any diagnoses were and all of that. And thankfully, I'm like saying that in quotation marks, I had not seen a therapist prior to that. But one of the things that I had always talked about during that process is that I felt like I really could have used therapy during my adoption, but I felt like the fact that they were requiring letters and so much documentation from any mental health professional that I saw actually dissuaded me from seeing a therapist during that time, because it felt like it was one more step in my millions of steps that I needed to do. And I knew that a lot of therapists felt wishy-washy about writing letters, and I knew that this was before I was a therapist too, but I was just doing a consult recently with a therapist because she knew that I was an adoptive parent and that I'd worked in adoption previously. And she was like, I just got this request for a letter and I'm wondering what I should include in it. Because she was like, I don't know what I should say. Like, what if they end up abusing their child and I'm the one that said that they were fit to be parents? And I kind of shared that with her, where I was like, this is an opportunity to talk to your client about how they're going to be parents, or how they want to, support their child, or like, what their hopes are. And then it's also, it's kind of an opportunity to then speak to the progress that they've made in therapy, and not necessarily be like, this person is going to be a kick-ass parent, but it's an opportunity to say, these are the things that they've talked about, or like even speaking to the fact that this person has navigated mental health services as an adult, and so they will know how to do that for their child later on, and being able to see that as a strength. Because I think at the time of this consult, the therapist was like, I don't know what to say in this. Like, and this feels like, again, I'm attaching my license, or I'm attaching my name to something that feels really big.
Sure, and what if something goes wrong?
And so I think in that scenario, it's similar to what you're saying. I kind of said, this is the chance to have these conversations with your client and say, like, well, what do you want me to be able to write to in this? Or what do you want me to be able to say? And then like, like minimum necessary, right? Like, what are you going to, you don't want to add too much information either. But yeah, I think that sometimes these letters feel like they can be really supportive for clients. And then there are other times where it feels like letters just kind of get in the way, or they can, not necessarily the letters from therapists, but like when you're requesting letters, it feels like, do I really have to do this? Is this something that I really need to do?
Or even just the time-consuming thing, right? Like, when do I have time to sit and write this letter? So I like the fact that you bring up, I can include the client in the conversation about what would you like me to put in there? What do you feel comfortable with me sharing? What shouldn't I share? Maybe let's write a draft together, because that can be helpful.
That's a good point. Do you ever write letters with clients like in the session together?
I've definitely filled out paperwork before. There was a client that wanted to have an emotional support cat at her college campus. And the college required not just a generic letter, but like it was this lengthy documentation that we started going through together. And I was like, I'm really struggling how I would fill this out for you.
Interesting.
And as we kind of went through, like, here are the things they're wanting to know about you. We both decided, like, okay, nope, we're just going to hard pause, and I don't really need that filled out.
Interesting. I wonder why, like, no, that's interesting. I was just thinking like that client that I had that needed a letter to like speak to their financial independence, and like, the one that I had just talked about, that was one that I did write in session with them too, because I was like, what do you want me to include in this? What do you think will be important? And then being able to like have a dialogue with her at the time, like, I don't think I can include this. I would feel more comfortable writing it in this way. That way we're having it like the conversation in real time, and I'm not giving them a letter that they can't use, then they're like, oh, what is this? But no, that was a tricky one.
And I think you could also put disclaimers in your letters, right? Like, thinking about that emotional support animal.
Yeah.
You could, as you mentioned previously, you could do a disclaimer that you haven't assessed the temperament of the dog. But I think you could do a disclaimer that, like, this letter was based on an evaluation on such and such date, right? That it's not that, like, I spent years getting to know this person, right? But, like, it was based on a single moment in time and this interaction.
Well, and one of the things that I talked with one of our director of compliance prior to this episode too, to just kind of say, when you write, she's a clinician, and I was like, when you write letters, like, how do you phrase this, or what do you include? And one of the things that she had recommended for any Ellie clients or Ellie clinicians that are listening to this was, she is an open book to be able to like review. She would love to think she had said any of the clinic directors and herself they're open books. They're happy to review letters. And really, if you're feeling like something is out of the scope of your practice, or feeling like, I don't know how to phrase this, or I don't know how to include this, then like, she welcomes being like reaching out to your supervisors, or reaching out to your clinical operations directors, or even to her to kind of review or give feedback on any of these too.
Yeah, I definitely make it a requirement for my pre-licensed clinicians that if they're going to send a letter, I want to review it.
That's a good
first.
idea.
But if they're independently licensed, they don't have to. But again, it's an option that they can send it to me. And then for my clinicians, I have a document that's a couple pages long that just gives some tips and tricks, or maybe links to templates or videos that you can watch. Because I might not be the expert on everything, but there are people out there that have more suggestions or recommendations on how to write these things. So I can point them in that direction.
What are some of your other tips and tricks that you give to them?
That's a good question. I think the only other thing I could add that we haven't already talked about actually is maybe just more about workplace accommodations. There's a
Oh.
resource out there called Ask Jan, and it's for workplace accommodations. You can also encourage the client to see what are reasonable accommodations and have them talk to their HR representative about next steps,
Hmm.
because sometimes they might not even need documentation from a therapist. Um, Again, we can review the client's job duties for their official job description, go line by line to explore what duties are impacted by their mental health condition.
That's a great idea because
Mhm.
I'm even thinking like I've had a client in the past who wanted to, this was like right after the pandemic happened, and they were wanting to stay remote and not have to
Mhm.
return to the office, and
Mhm.
even just wanting to have some sort of letter or documentation saying that they couldn't go back into the office. And so
Mhm.
even just talking to them about, like what parts of your job are impacted or by your mental health,
Mhm.
what would going into the office mean for you? Like how do you feel like that would exacerbate your mental health? And just kind of
Mhm.
exploring some of those things makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I've had a clinician write a generic letter about a client needing some accommodations. And it was interesting. The employer came back and really kind of like highlighted line by line, like, tell us more about why you recommended this. And so I
Mm,
think sometimes we do have to be careful when we say, yeah, like, yep, they only need to work in office Tuesdays
interesting.
and Thursdays, right?
Yeah.
And the employer was like, why those days versus other days or
Interesting.
things like that. So I think
Mm-hmm.
definitely we can explore and maybe write that they
Mm-hmm.
may benefit from a flexible work schedule, but that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean we have to dictate what
Yes.
specific days they have to work in office versus they can't.
Mm-hmm.
I think unless we were able to come up with additional rationale as to,
Mm-hmm.
yep, you should be able to work from home specifically on Mondays and Fridays
Mm-hmm.
versus maybe other days of the week.
Interesting. Well, because that's when the team meetings aren't, or I don't know, something like that.
Hmm.
But no, I think that when you're writing a letter, like thinking about what sort of questions the employer or the landlord, like these different people could come back to you with is helpful
Hmm.
because you're almost like anticipating, if they're asking for proof of this, or maybe not proof, but like
Hmm.
if they're asking for rationale around some things, I think that helps you kind of recognize, okay, is this just an opinion or is this something that actually comes from fact or something that, the client is saying
Hmm.
or, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Or even being able to say, like, we had a conversation on this date about this, or like why this would be helpful, or I don't know if some things like that would work, but
Hmm.
interesting. I think that's part of the fear too of like what happens when they come back and they're like, well, why? Or what comes. And so I think you have to be like proactively having those
Hmm.
conversations with your client and being ready for any questions. But I am curious, like if like let's say you write a letter, you give it to your client to pass on to their HR, and then HR comes back to you. You can't talk to them without a release of information though. And so
Hmm.
realistically, like um your client would have to be in the middle of some of these conversations, or like, or would have to give a release of information so that you
Hmm.
can talk to them.
Yeah. It's probably a good rule of thumb to have a release anyways, even if
Mm-hmm.
you are going to fill out a letter
That's a
for
good
their
idea.
employer, right? Just have that ROI for that letter.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Hmm.
Hmm. Thinking of other types of letters or things that I've seen, questions that I've seen too about this. Do you have any clinicians, or have you heard of any clinicians just straight up being like, I won't write any letters?
Mm. I don't know of any clinicians that truly will say, I will never write a
Mm-hmm.
letter. I think a lot of them try their hardest not to write letters.
Really?
Because again, they're time consuming.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned earlier, right? Is this in my scope? Is this
Yeah.
not? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they would prefer to delegate to someone else that maybe
Mm-hmm.
has more experience writing that letter. But also, if you're seeing 30 clients a week, 25 clients a week, whatever, I mean, that adds up,
Mm-hmm.
plus your documentation time on top of it. Okay, and
Yeah.
now I have to write this letter and I need to look at ADA accommodations or
Mm.
templates or, it's time consuming.
Mhm. Well, and yeah, especially if you feel like have never written a letter like this before. Or, I mean, that's why it's
Mhm.
so helpful to work with Jen, because she has lots of different templates and things. You can say, hey, do you have a template for this? And then she has it usually. But it is, I've heard of clinicians charging for letters before. Have you ever heard of that? Of saying like, okay, my admin time is this X amount. I mean, I don't know how you would bill insurance for anything like that. And so
I don't think you can.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't think you can. And so that's probably just for like cash pay private practices or something where they're like, yeah, I will do this for this amount of money. But
Yeah.
no, that makes sense. But then I think we had oh my gosh, at least a year ago, we had a podcast episode with Dr. Claire Gerber, and we talked about autism. And she was like, you bet I'll write letters. Like I would, like she actually helped me feel more positively towards letters, because she was like, give me the chance to advocate for my clients. I would love to. And so I think that she had a really good outlook of like, if there's something that if there's an accommodation at school, or if there's something that I can do that's going to help this kid succeed, you bet I'm going to do it. And so it made me feel like, oh, yeah, like, why are we so wishy-washy and like pushing, like, yes, it takes time. Yes, it can be intimidating. But at the same time, like if we truly believe that something is going to be helpful for our clients, and we have had conversations with them about this, and we think that, yeah, this is absolutely worth it, then it's an opportunity to speak to the amazing progress that they've made, or the opportunity to speak to how this is going to help improve their lives and help advocate for them. So I think hopefully people can listen to a podcast episode like this, get some tools so that they, like some of like, it demystifies some of the scariness, while also feeling like, yeah, I feel a little bit more prepared to actually advocate for my clients in this way.
Yeah. And realistically, how often are you being asked to write letters?
Not very often. Right. What about you?
Yeah. Maybe once a year sometimes. I'm trying to think of the frequency that it really happens. I'm sure some clinicians, if you specialize in a certain area, right? Like if you are someone who works a lot with individuals who are transgender, you probably write out maybe more letters than someone who doesn't specialize with that population. Or if you have word out that you write a lot of emotional support animal letters, right? I mean, then you might get more. But in general, it's probably not all that frequent.
I'm wondering too, like, how often do you think, I think that sometimes our go-to is to write letters so that we don't need to have conversations with other professionals. When like, I'm just thinking of times where, I actually get on the phone and talk to a med provider, or times when I actually, am a part of an IEP meeting, or I'm actually having a conversation with foster parents, or, like things like this, where it's like those, I think sometimes it feels like, oh, I'll just write a letter and that will be my contribution, or like I'll speak to, I think especially with school stuff, like, yeah, I'll say that this is your diagnosis or whatever, and these are the treatment goals. But I just think of the times when I've actually been able to be a part of some of those meetings, and yes, I don't get paid for those, but like the impact it actually makes on the benefit, like the accommodations, or being able to, actually have, like contribute to some of the changes in the conversation and advocate for your client in that way. I think that that's always been more helpful than just a letter too in the long run. But sometimes a letter is all you get asked for. But this has been so helpful, Jen. Like just having all of these tips and talking through all of these different things has been really good. Have you ever had a clinician get in trouble for a letter that they've written?
No. I mean, the closest is that one that I referenced where they asked for more information.
Yeah.
Right? We need more supporting documentation as to why they need this specific accommodation. But other than that, yeah, nobody's ever gotten in trouble for writing the letter.
Yeah. I mean, but I ask that kind of in a cheeky way to be like, you're doing this to support your clients. And yes, you need to have rationale for the different things that you're speaking to in the letter. But ultimately, you're doing this as a support to your client. And you're not going to, in most cases, get called up onto a court stand to talk through every single, like recommendation you made. Unless that's your population, then maybe you will.
Yeah. another way I was going to say that is there's a difference between probability and possibility, right? So we, as clinicians, might be very fearful of putting our name on something, writing something for the what if, right? But again, it's possible, but how probable is it? As long as you are writing something
in good faith.
In good faith, yes.
Yeah, you're writing something in good faith. You have, like the conversations to back it up. You can actually speak to, I'm writing this for this reason, not just because they want to save money on pet rent or something. But
and although I reference a template, right, it's not like you're using the same, just slapping a different name on everything, right? And signing off on it, right? So again, in good faith, am I really taking the time to assess this specific individual and their needs and writing this letter in support of them?
No, that's super helpful. Any other last tips or things that you feel like we haven't covered with this?
I mean, nothing that I can think of.
Yeah.
But I mean, utilize those resources online. There's YouTube videos and all sorts of templates that are available. So know that you're not necessarily starting from scratch.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you are a clinician in the Ellie network, reach out to one of us and we're happy to share templates. But if you are outside of the Ellie network, I would highly recommend joining like different Facebook groups for therapists, because they're always talking about letter writing. People are always sharing their own templates on there too. And so while I wouldn't just like straight up blindly use another therapist's letter, but I think it's a good starting place to be like, this is the sort of information that I should be including in here. And this is the type of question that hundreds of therapists have asked on these different message boards too. So you're just by searching this, you're going to get a lot of different opinions and ideas and, what to include, what not to include. And so if you're feeling stuck and you aren't surrounded by a community of clinicians that can help you kind of formulate this or give you feedback on some of this, highly recommend reaching out or joining a community in that way too. But if you're an Ellie clinician, and we think you should be, definitely reach out to creative at Ellie Mental Health, and I can pass along some of the templates that we have used internally too. But if in doubt, ask your clinical director, your clinic supervisor, because they also have these resources and they've been doing this a lot longer than I have. So it's helpful to have more people to give advice or lay eyes on the different things that we're writing, especially if we're new at it. So it's helpful. Awesome. Thanks for joining, and thank you for bringing this topic. This has been a good episode and hopefully has demystified some of this for people and given some good ideas for what to include, what not to include, and how to do this the right way.
Thanks for having me.